Hi everybody and welcome to Heel Heat. My name is George Coles and on this episode we're doing a top 10. Topic of the top 10, WCW World Heavyweight Champions. Now there's a few things I'm going to say up front. I'm going to call this the championship, the world championship, the heavyweight title, the WCW title. All means the same thing, WCW World Heavyweight Championship. We're going from the time frame where it officially split off from the NWA Championship, which is January 11th, 1991, to the very last Nitro, which is March 26th, 2001. So a little bit over a 10-year period here that we're covering. With all that being said, let's jump right into this. Number 10. Big Papa Pump, the Big Bad Booty Daddy, Scott Steiner. Scott Steiner had one title reign, and honestly, thinking back of the time frame, I really thought he had more. I thought he was a 3 or 4-time champion. His title reign was that impactful for me. In the last few years of WCW, he was one of the very bright spots, one of the stars that broke out, and he went from one of the great tag teams of all time, the Steiner brothers, on the top 10 on everybody's lists, to being a great single star. And his breakout was amazing. He came out with what was basically an updated version of the Superstar Billy Graham gimmick, and he made it his own. And he had amazing promos, and don't get me wrong, they were train wrecks, but they were also amazing, and you couldn't turn away from them. And he was just great out there, and he had a magnetism, he had an aura about him. You felt what Scott Steiner was saying. Like I said, one of the high points of the late WCW run, I think, for the reasons as he only had one championship, that's why he's this low on the list. Our number 9, the total package, Lex Luger. Lex Luger had 2 runs with the championship, and the reason he's this low is because both runs kind of felt like he was a transitional champion. It didn't feel like Lex Luger ever held the belt and was going to be the focal point of the company. One of his runs lasts 6 days. Even though he has one of the great moments in Monday Nitro history, him beating Hulk Hogan for the World Championship, he loses it 6 days later in a pay-per-view. Back to Hogan. And it was reported that was part of a contract he signed, that he would be the world champion at some point. I think that they could have ran more with Luger than they did. I know he's absolutely looked at as a legend, and hindsight being 2020, he's one of the guys that a lot of people look to WCW and say that's a WCW guy in Lex Luger. However, he never, to me, was pushed to be the main guy. He was always behind Hogan, behind Sting, behind Flair. Always somebody else seemed more important than Luger, hence why he's this low in the list, in my opinion. Now, coming from that, our number 8. One of the most historical champions of all time. He had a one-time run as the WCW champion, and that's the All-American Ron Simmons. A lot of people point to this and say this is the first black, African-American, whatever you're going to say, World Heavyweight Champion. And to some degree that's correct. To a lot of degrees that's wrong. There were other black athletes that had became world champions in the territory days. However, on a big mainstream level, this was the first guy. And he was the first guy and the only guy for a long while, up until later in WCW. He was a standard bearer. In WWE, it took even years longer than that for them to get there, to make that change. For a lot of reasons, Ron Simmons is looked at as the Jackie Robinson of wrestling, in a way. In a lot of ways, other wrestlers like Bobo Brazil are more considered that. But for the groundbreaking nature of it, it makes it on the list. However, the reason why he's this low on the list is because it felt like once his World Championship run was done, I don't think WCW had any idea what to do next. They didn't know what the next step was, how to get him back in the title contention, how to make him stay interesting. And looking at Ron Simmons and being a huge fan of Ron Simmons, how do you not know what to do with Ron Simmons? I mean, the guy's a great talker, he's a great wrestler, he has charisma, he has undeniable believability, and All-American from Florida State University, a college football Hall of Famer. A lot of people knew his name before he got into wrestling. He had that immense credibility of being a major football star on a major college football team that in that time period was one of the 3 or 4 best teams in the whole country. I just don't know afterwards, and unfortunately, that's the reason he's on this list so low, because they never quite understood what to do next with him. And it's really sad, because to me, Ron Simmons is an amazing talent. Now, coming from Ron Simmons, our number 7, the Macho Man, Randy Savage. And that was a terrible impersonation, I know. Much like I said with Steiner, coming off of the Steiners being one of the great tag teams of all time, Randy Macho Man Savage is one of the great singles wrestlers of all time. Savage had 4 world championship reigns during this time period, and that sounds very impressive until you go back and look at them. Other than the very last one, the other 3, he was a secondary character on their show. Even though he was a world champion, the Hulk Hogan story was more important than the Randy Savage story. And that's kind of a shame, and it's kind of the albatross that followed his whole career, whether it be WWF at the time or WCW. It always felt like he was going to be second banana to Hulk Hogan. And that's really sad, because to me and to a lot of people, we liked Randy Savage way more than we did Hulk Hogan. Not knocking Hulk Hogan or Hulk Hogan's fans, but Savage was just as important. Savage was just as credible. He was a major, major star, known outside of the world of wrestling. But again, because the era it was in, he felt like he was a second fiddle. Much like I said with Luger. Savage had a lot of the same drawbacks that Luger had were drawbacks to Savage's title reigns. Hence why he's only number 7 here, where if you ask me if he's a top 10 wrestler of all time, he's going to be much higher than 7 in my opinion. Now coming from that, our number 6, Bill Goldberg. This is another one that I was surprised about. Goldberg only had 1 WCW World Heavyweight Championship run. Again, another one much like Steiner, I felt like there was more. And maybe it's because he did so much with that 1 world title run that it did make it feel like it was more than that. And it wasn't a long run either. I feel like much like I said with Scott Steiner, the end of the WCW the last few years, Goldberg was the guy. He was the guy that they built up from their power plant as to being their main homebrewed star. He was the guy to take over that mantle from Sting. And I never personally, again, and this is just a personal opinion, Goldberg never was really someone I was a huge fan of, but I can't deny that he had an immense fan base and an immense following. I can't deny what he meant to WCW. Even though his run was not as long as a lot of the other runs here, and it was only 1, Goldberg was an important staple in WCW, and he's still one of the people that when you say WCW, you see Goldberg holding the big gold belt. Now coming off of Goldberg, we're going into our number 5, Big Van Vader. Much like I said with Ron Simmons and Randy Savage, he has a lot of the same issues as the both of them had. I don't think outside of Vader's championship runs they ever really knew what to do with him. He did win the title 3 times. I think he kind of felt kind of victim, much like Savage to the Hulk Hogan era. When Hulk Hogan came in, it kind of made Big Van Vader look not as important as he was prior to that. And it's a real shame because they could have built to an ultimate blow-off Vader versus Hogan, Andre versus Hogan style match, but they really didn't. We did get a couple matches between the two, but they never felt really that important. Vader had felt marginalized by that point, not made to feel as destructive and as dangerous as he once was. Unfortunate, and it's really unfortunate because Vader is one of the great big men of all time. I keep saying great of all time, and if you look at this list, it's littered with people that are considered greats at one thing or another of all time. Just really disappointing how it ended, even though his 3 runs were super dominant, in my opinion. And coming from that, our number 4, the 5-time, actually I believe he's 4-time. No, he was 5-time. 5-time WCW World Champion at this point. I believe he added another 6. He either added the 5th or the 6th run when it was a WWF version. Don't quote me on that, I might be wrong. Booker T. Much like Scott Steiner, Booker T had broke out from being one of the fantastic tag teams of all time, Harlem Heat, and became a solo star all on his own. Booker organically, again, like I said with Steiner, like I mentioned with Goldberg, in the last few years of WCW, especially that last year and a half or so, Booker T really felt like he was the most important wrestler on that show. He felt like he was the highlight of the show, and he was the guy that was carrying the ship, even though I understand that it wasn't a downtime for WCW. He was still the main guy there, and he really felt important. I love Booker T. I think he's a great wrestler. I always have thought he was a great wrestler. I loved Harlem Heat. This was an awesome way for Booker to keep going and Booker to be shown here in such a high praise. I was really excited. I remember the real breakout with Booker was he did a series of 7 matches with Chris Benoit over the World Television title, where it really showed that not only is this guy a great tag wrestler, but he can really be a great solo wrestler as well. Now coming from that, our number 3, you've heard me mention him a couple times in a somewhat negative light, Hollywood Hulk Hogan. Hogan had 6 WCW World Championship reigns here. And I don't want this to sound bad. I'm not trying to knock him. I know I've said some things that can be construed in that. This ain't a knock on the guy. He is obviously one of the 2 or 3 most popular wrestlers in the history of wrestling. There's no denying that. He's part of one of the biggest stables in the history of wrestling, the NWO, one of the biggest stories in the history of wrestling, the NWO. He helped create WrestleMania. Hulk Hogan has done a ton for the world of wrestling. I know I'm saying all this because in some of the previous introduction, or not introductions, we're not putting him in a Hall of Fame, the previous selections, I've talked about Hogan a little bit negatively. However, all that adds to the positivity of Hogan brought credibility to the WCW Championship. It had already had some credibility from guys like Vader having it and Ric Flair, but for a guy like Hulk Hogan, who's looked at most of the world at the time as the professional wrestler, the one wrestler that everybody in the world knew, for him to be the world champion really elevated that world championship. And for him to have that title during the NWO run, being the ultimate guy that Goldberg had to beat, being the ultimate guy that Sting had to beat, also added to that. Say what you will about Hulk Hogan after, or Hulk Hogan's problems, we know he's had many. You cannot deny what Hulk Hogan did for the bottom line of WCW and his importance to the history of wrestling in general. Now, coming from that, our number 2, one of Hulk Hogan's biggest foes at the time, the Icon Sting. Sting also had 6 World Championship runs, whether it be from his early years being made by Ric Flair, to his matches with Hogan, matches with the Giant, matches with Sting, matches with Vader. Sting was the one constant all through WCW. He was the one guy that was either at the top of the card or very high on the card from the beginning to the end. He was the flagship of WCW. He was the main baby face in the company for the entire run. A lot of people, Sting is starting to get his flowers now. A lot of people are giving him the praise that he's always deserved. There was a long time where Sting wasn't looked at as a great wrestler, or Sting was just looked at as just a WCW guy. And that's really a shame, because Sting was fantastic. Sting was a really solid wrestler. His charisma was off the charts. His promos were good. I don't want to put him in that level where he's a great promo guy. They worked. They worked for his character. The fans absolutely ate Sting up. He was just the man in WCW, and I loved it. I loved his run in WCW. I thought he was awesome there, hence why he's up this high on my list. Now, before we get to our number 1, we're going to do a little thing we do here on these top 10s called the best of the rest. Basically, it's wrestlers that were considered for the list but didn't quite make it. First up, Big Sexy Kevin Nash. Kevin Nash had five WCW World Championship runs, and other than him beating Goldberg and losing it, I believe a week later, not even a week later, I can't remember any of them, really. I know he had them. I remember him having the belt. There's not really any memorable matches, any real memorable feuds with it. I remember him carrying the belt. I can't say I remember any specific matches. I love Kevin Nash. I'm a huge Kevin Nash fan. This is not a knock on him. When I look at the list and the rest of the people on here, I remember fondly matches. I remember fondly feuds with them being the champion. Nash, unfortunately, I don't as much. And for that reason, and I think most of the five runs were less than 30 days, that's why Nash didn't make the list. Now, last but not least on the best of the rest, Double J, old Slapnuts himself, Jeff Jarrett. Jeff had 4 championship reigns here. And much like I just said with Nash, a lot of them were quick 1-week reign. He had a lot of title reigns in that Russo era where it seemed like him and Booker T and a couple other guys were trading the belt back and forth. It was used more as a prop than it was used as a real championship. I rather enjoy Jeff Jarrett. I enjoy his wrestling style. I think he gets derided a lot for his run in TNA, which I think is fantastic, actually. I think if you go back and watch some of them Jeff Jarrett matches, he was absolutely the right decision to be the guy carrying the ball for TNA. I mean, if he's not the best wrestler on the show, he's one of the 2 or 3. It's either him, Joe, AJ, or Angle when Angle eventually got there. I mean, he deserved to be where he was. He was a great storyteller. For the reasons, well, again, much like I said with Nash, not a lot of memorable stuff here. Mostly came during the Russo period. For that reason, he didn't make the list. Now, before we get into our number 1, if you think I left somebody off the list, put someone down too low, put someone too high, let me know what you think. Well, hit me up in the comments, smash the like button, subscribe if you haven't. And now, with all that being said, our number 1 WCW World Heavyweight Champion, the Nature Boy, Ric Flair. You had to know this was coming if you've seen this list, and you had to expect his name somewhere on here. 7 times he was WCW champion. the man, the limousine riding, jet flying, kiss stealing, wheeling dealing son of a gun. Everything that you could say about Ric Flair is true, bad and good. Ric Flair is absolutely an icon of wrestling, in my opinion. Himself and Terry Funk are the two greatest wrestlers of all time, and I'll go back and forth all the time on who's better than the other, so I always just say they both are. To me, no one exemplifies the big gold belt, the WCW Championship, more than Ric Flair. He's the one that had it made for himself. He's the one that carried it. He carried it into the WWF at the time when he went there as a real world champion. There was an aura about Ric Flair that very few people have had in wrestling or any other sport. Ric Flair almost felt like Magic Johnson did in the NBA, or Wayne Gretzky did in the NHL, or, if you like baseball, I hate to say, half the guys I'm thinking of are all steroid users, so I don't want to put them in that league. But let's say a Hank Aaron in baseball, where if he's not the greatest of all time, he's in the conversation of the greatest of all time. And yes, I know not a lot of people put Magic up there, but we're comparing the 80s. You get it. Ric Flair is pro wrestling. Pro wrestling is Ric Flair. His legend only grows the longer we go on in time. Even this time, by the time I started watching wrestling, which I was about 6 years old, which would have put it in 1983, Ric Flair was already a champion a couple times. I believe he was in his second or third run by the time I watched. He already felt like a legend when I started watching wrestling, and he's about to have his last match at the time of this recording in, I believe, a month or so. So we're talking almost a 40-year run for a guy that's just synonymous with the sport. I mean, you can't say pro wrestling without saying Ric Flair. Just an amazing talent. In my opinion, the greatest WCW champion of all time. And if you really put my feet to the fire, greatest world champion in any company of all time. Like I said, this is my opinion on what the top 10 is. If you think I'm wrong, let me know in the comments. Hit me up. Tell me who you think I left off. If you think it's, again, someone's too high, too low, let me know. Hit me up down here. And if you made it all the way to the end of the video, I would say give me 2 claps and a Ric Flair. And you guys, if you're watching this, you know what that is. But let's go ahead and put a woo in the comments for the Nature Boy. And I know that was a weak one, so we're going to go out with it. I'm going to say it at the end. My name is George Coles, and this has been another Heel Heat Top 10. Woo!